Hi, and welcome to this video on specialised cells. Now these are cells that have extra additional features or are lacking in the features found in the general animal and plant cells covered in another video. Unlike prokaryotes, eukaryotes like us are multicellular, and to work one cell type won't cut it. So our cells actually differentiate into around 300 other cell types, each one intrinsically designed to do a certain job. Now I'm going to start talking about some specialised animal cells, and it is worth pointing out how these specialised cells differ from the features that are typical in an animal cell. I thought I'd be nice and include one here to remind you that animal cells will have a cytoplasm, they will have a cell membrane, they will have a nucleus, unless they're red blood cells. These cells don't actually have a nucleus because their job is to carry oxygen, and a nucleus is such a big structure that actually not having a nucleus helps a red blood cell to carry more oxygen and do its job better. Animal cells also have a mitochondria, they have ribosomes. So when you're looking at these specialised cells, what do they have that's different, and why do they have these differences? We've got a nerve cell here and a sperm cell, and they both do very different jobs. A nerve cell needs to conduct electrical impulses around the body, while a sperm cell needs to travel towards and fertilise an egg. Now both of these cells contain a nucleus, which is typical of an animal cell, unless it's a red blood cell of course. The nucleus in a nerve cell is no different really from the nucleus of any other animal cell. However, the nucleus of a sperm cell is quite different. It actually only contains half the DNA needed to make that individual, the dad's half. The other half will be found in the egg cell that the sperm needs to fertilise. But before fertilisation actually happens, the sperm cell needs to get there, and the sperm will need to swim towards that egg. So a tail would come in handy. But swimming is an energy zapping process. So even though both cells have mitochondria, which again is a typical feature of animal cells, a sperm cell has a lot more mitochondria. And these mitochondria are located in this section of the sperm cell, so that they can provide the energy to power the whip-like motion of the tail, which helps to propel the sperm cell forward. When it reaches the egg, it has another difficulty to overcome, and that is to actually get through the tough outer barrier of the egg cell. So sperm cells have this additional feature, which is called an acrosome, and an acrosome is basically a package that contains very powerful enzymes to break through the egg's outer layer. Sperm cells tend to work on their own. Nerve cells, on the other hand, work alongside other nerve cells to form nervous tissue. And to connect to all of those other nerve cells, they have these branch-like structures called dendrites that enable one nerve cell to connect with other cells. Nerve cells might look like they have a tail too, but let's not forget these cells don't swim, so there is no need for a tail. This long structure here is actually called an axon, and it can be very, very long. In a blue whale, the axon can reach 25 meters in length, and the longest axon in your body is the one that stretches from the base of your spine all the way down your leg to your big toe. If you wiggle your big toe right now, you are activating this nerve cell. Like an electrical wire that has a plastic coating around it, these nerve cells have a myelin sheath that acts like the plastic coating to insulate the electrical impulse. At the end of a nerve cell, chemicals called neurotransmitters are released, allowing a nerve cell to communicate with other parts of your nervous system, be it a nerve cell or an effector like a muscle or gland, by releasing these chemicals across gaps called synapses, which are found here. So at the end of these cells, you have got these terminals that have packets containing these neurotransmitters that get released across a tiny little gap that you will find between this nerve cell and another part of the nervous system. There are 3 types of muscle cell in your body. All of them are designed to contract. Some muscle cells contract automatically, some we consciously control. Cardiac muscle contracts automatically to keep your heart beating, while smooth muscle contracts in your gut to push your food along. We do control our skeletal muscle contractions. These muscles are striated, where the cells run as parallel fibres that appear striped. special proteins help the fibres slide past each other when the muscle contracts. These proteins can be found as illustrated here. These contractions do require a lot of energy, so you will find a lot more mitochondria in a muscle cell compared to most other animal cells, and those mitochondria transfer energy from glucose for these contractions in the reactions of aerobic respiration. But sometimes the glucose that's needed to provide this energy could run out, and that glucose comes from the glucose going through your digestive system. So when you have excess glucose building up in your body, it gets stored as a molecule called glycogen, and you find lots and lots of glycogen reserves in these muscle cells too. And that glycogen, when needed, can be broken down to release glucose that could then be used in respiration to transfer energy to these cells to enable them to contract. Remember, in a separate video I mentioned that plant cells have extra features on top of those in animal cells. These extra features include a cell wall, vacuole and chloroplasts. This general cell is actually based on a palisade cell, which has the sole job of photosynthesis, trapping sunlight to make food. One of the reactants for photosynthesis is water, and this comes from the soil through the roots. A specialised cell worth learning about is a root hair cell, not to be confused with the hair roots on your head. Root hair cells in plants are underground in the soil, and their job is to absorb water and mineral ions and transfer these into the actual plant from the soil. Where absorption is involved, a good way of speeding up the rate of absorption is to have a large surface area, and these cells can accommodate that by having this long hair-like extension where they get their name from. Water actually moves very, very easily into these root hair cells by osmosis. Mineral ions, however, have to kind of be forced into these root hair cells because there's actually quite a large concentration of mineral ions inside these plant cells already. So the way in which these mineral ions are moved into the plant cell is an energy consuming process called active transport, and in order to fuel this process, again, you're going to need to have many mitochondria. So you see many mitochondria in these cells. So these would be the mitochondria. And you will always find a large permanent vacuole in these root hair cells for water to move into by osmosis. And very, very importantly, there are no chloroplasts at all in root hair cells. What's the point? Chloroplasts are there to absorb sunlight. These cells are underground. There's no chance sunlight's going to reach them. Some other specialised plant cells can be found in the stem of the plant, and they go all the way up through the veins that you see running through the leaves. On this side we have got xylem cells. These cells are there to transport water and mineral ions from the roots to the leaves. They're actually made from cells that have died, and whilst they were living, the cell walls that they had kind of broke down in the middle and leaving the xylem as a hollow tube. But this hollow tube has to be strengthened. If you imagine a tree that's like 50 meters tall, it has to be very, very structurally strong. So these xylem vessels have been fortified by a spiraled molecule called lignin, which is really, really, really strong. On this side you have got phloem cells, and phloem cells transport the products of photosynthesis. The products of this chemical reaction are oxygen and glucose. Oxygen is the waste product, and glucose really is the jackpot because it's the fuel that the plant needs to keep going to stay alive. And this fuel, once it's been made in the leaves, needs to be transported to the rest of the plant, and it's transported through these phloem cells. Unlike xylem cells, the phloem cells are still living. The cell wall similarly has broken down in the middle but not completely, and it's formed these sieve plates. So if you imagine a sieve that you might have in your kitchen, it allows water to flow through, and that water in the phloem will have lots and lots and lots of dissolved sugars in the form of glucose. And by having these sieve plates, those sugars can flow really, really freely, and the movement of these dissolved sugars through the phloem from the leaves to the rest of the plant has a special name, which is translocation. So these are still living cells. So they'll have a cytoplasm, but they don't really have a lot of other cellular features. They're very minimalistic to basically allow them to transport the products of photosynthesis. So to keep the phloem cells going, to supply them with energy, you have these companion cells. And again, they'll have lots of mitochondria to transfer their energy into the phloem cells. Okay, so these root hair cells here, as I've mentioned before, have this hair-like projection to increase the surface area, to absorb water by osmosis and mineral ions by active transport. So these two things, water and mineral ions, move into these root hair cells, and then they will subsequently move into these root cells. So these are just cells that are found in the roots, but they do not have this extension of their surface area, and they'll flow through several layers of these root cells until the water and mineral ions get into this xylem vessel. And once inside the xylem, the water and the dissolved mineral ions get transported all the way up the xylem to the leaves where those things are actually needed. And this movement is driven by a process called the transpiration stream. So I'm just going to put transpiration here. And it's essentially based on the principle that water molecules actually kind of stick quite loosely together, and they get pulled as like one unit all the way up the xylem, and that the leaves themselves, water is evaporating out of the leaves through these tiny holes called stomata, which I will cover in more detail in a later video. So water is basically evaporating from the top of the plant, and because water molecules stick together, when one water molecule evaporates and turns into water vapour, it creates a void, and all the water molecules below it get kind of pulled upwards, and this whole process is called transpiration. So as you can see here, you have a root hair cell, which is a specialised plant cell, working in conjunction with just bog standard root cells, as well as the xylem vessel to transport water and minerals upwards through a plant. So the final part of this video, I want to cover the cellular organisation that you will find in multicellular organisms, where you have cells that work together to form a tissue, that work together to form an organ, several organs that work together create an organ system, and when you've got several organ systems working together, you have an organism. So in the example I've just gone through, you have these specialised root hair cells working together in root tissue. The root hair cells, along with the root cells, give you the organ of the root, and the root itself, alongside the xylem and the phloem, form the organ system called the transport system, and this, alongside other systems within the plant, creates the actual organism itself. So this hierarchical structure can also be seen in animals. With the example of the nerve cell, you can have millions of nerve cells working together to form nervous tissue, and you will find nervous tissue alongside muscular tissue and other tissue types in an organ such as the heart, and the heart could be found within the circulatory organ system, and this particular system, amongst other organ systems, collectively help to operate the organism, in this case the human. Muscle cells, which we covered earlier, can form muscular tissue, and in the example of smooth muscle, you will need those to form an organ such as the intestine, and that could be the small or large intestine, which you find in the digestive system, and this, alongside other organ systems, would create the actual organism itself. So just to summarise, I did mention some key terms here. You may need to define some of these in your exam, so here are some quick definitions. Cells are the building blocks of life. Specialised cells have differentiated to have different or extra structures to suit their job. Tissues are groups of cells with a similar structure and function. Organs are collections of tissues performing similar functions. Organ systems are collections of organs working together to form an organism. And translocation is a term used to describe the movement of dissolved sugars and water through the phloem from the leaves. So that covers this video on specialised cells and cellular organisation in organisms. Thank you very much for watching.